Good afternoon. Peter Carson here from Extranet User Manager, and welcome to our webinar on how to build a structured extranet using Azure AD B2B. Quick introductions for those of you not familiar with me. I'm the president of Extranet User Manager in Envision IT, located up in Mississauga, Ontario, Canada. Also a SharePoint MVP and a partner seller with Microsoft Canada. All my contact information is up here, and we're going to be sharing the deck and the recording. For those of you that are not able to attend, we'll send a follow-up email if you want to share this with colleagues. By all means, feel free to do that and reach out to me if you have any questions from there as well. A little history on Extranet User Manager. It's been around for a little over 10 years now. It's started out as a very bespoke product, and then about 3-4 years ago started to brand it and push it out as its own standalone product. Added in Azure B2B support that we're going to be talking about today about 3 years ago, actually. It's really matured, both from our point of view and from Microsoft's. They've really extended what you're able to do with that platform, and we're excited to share that with you today. A little history on where Extranet User Manager is currently deployed. I think the number is actually a little higher than 85 plus. We're getting close to 100 customers globally deployed that. We're located in Canada, so a lot of North American customers, both in Canada and the US, but also Europe, Asia, Australia as well. So a quick agenda of what we're going to go over today. We've done the introductions. We're going to briefly talk about unstructured extranets, which is not the main topic here, but I want to compare and contrast. And then we're going to dive deeper into structured extranets and Azure AD B2B. We'll explain what B2B is as well as part of that process. We're going to go into an overview of using that with our Extranet User Manager product, and in particular with Office 365. We've got a new Groups and Users SharePoint Framework web part. We're going to demonstrate that both in SharePoint and in Microsoft Teams, and we'll finish up with a little touch on site provisioning, how that fits into the solution, which is likely going to be our next webinar topic for early in September as well. We've got questions open as we go through. We've got moderators on the webinar as well, so if you've got questions as we're going through, feel free to ask those. I won't be watching those as I'm speaking, but we will follow up towards the end and catch any ones that didn't get caught as we go through that process. I want to start with a quick poll just to get a sense from the audience point of view of who's using what today. So let me just open up this poll. Let me give you half a minute or so just to answer back. Are you currently using Office 365, Microsoft Flow, Power BI, SharePoint on-premises? They're multi-select. You can choose more than one if you've got multiple within there. All right, let me give you another 10 seconds or so, the last few to vote in there, and then we'll share that back. So let me close that out and then share that. So just to give you a quick sense, almost everybody in Office 365, not surprising, that's the topic for today's conversation, and also not surprising, I mean, we've seen a huge shift. It's been happening for years, but it's really accelerated over the last year or so. I would say that people are really moving away from on-premises and into Office 365. And if folks aren't there already, typically have some sort of plans to move off of on-premises from that point of view. Microsoft Flow, about 2/3. That's awesome to see. It's a great product. We're going to talk a bit more about that. Power BI, less so there. We're actually not going to touch on it today, but it is something that we support with our product as well, providing a Power BI dashboard to give you a sense of how people are using our product and how they're logging in, sites they're using, such from an analytics point of view. It's very powerful and useful from that point of view. But 60% still running SharePoint on-premises. Everything that we're talking about here today is intended for Office 365, but it doesn't mean it's exclusive to that. So what we've created is a solution that actually works both SharePoint on-premises and in the cloud as well. So if you are still primarily on-premises, don't worry, what we're going to be going through here today still applies to that scenario as well. So let me hide that and continue on to our next slide in here. So as I mentioned, we're going to start with a quick background on unstructured extranets with Office 365 external sharing. If you are in the cloud with Office 365, you're probably familiar with the fact that you can share both from your OneDrive and from your SharePoint Online actually quite easily. And Microsoft's done a lot of cool stuff around that. They've really enhanced the user experience around that. I actually really encourage this if you're sharing with a smaller number of people. Maybe you've just got a couple people, maybe a couple dozen people, let's say a board of directors or a marketing agency that you're working with, that you're sharing documents with, scenarios like that. use the out of the box. It actually works really well in that scenario. You can send secure links to entire sites, to libraries, to folders, to specific documents, and there's a number of ways that you can share, whether it's an anonymous link, it's only for people in your organization with existing access, or you can actually name specific people and lock it down just to those folks. We have an article up on our site that talks about some of the new interesting features that have been announced, particularly at the SharePoint conference just 2 months ago. And actually, we have an interview that I did with Mark Cashman and Stephen Rice, two of the folks from the Microsoft product team in Redmond, just talking about external sharing and some of the interesting new things that they've done and how we compare and contrast that with what we do with Extranet User Manager and where our value proposition lies in as part of that. It's about an 8-minute interview. I encourage you to have a look if you haven't had a chance yet. So that's really as far as we're going to go from an unstructured point of view. We're going to spend most of the time talking about structured extranets. And what do we mean by that term? Well, it's when you've got hundreds, thousands, even hundreds of thousands of external users. The ability to one at a time invite people in by email address is great, but it doesn't really scale to that larger scale of extranet. And it may represent lots of different groups of external users. Maybe you're running projects and you've got external project members, committees. I mentioned board of directors. Those can actually get quite large in some situations. You want to create a customer portal, a vendor portal, a partner portal. Anything that you want to scale up to a larger size of external users is where you want to have some structure to that. And the business owners to those can be many different individuals as well. You don't want IT to be the gatekeeper in managing all those external users. You want to extend that and delegate that down to the business owners, whether those folks are within your organization, or there's even scenarios where you might want to extend the ownership of those groups out to external groups themselves. Now, a bit of explanation for those of you that are not familiar with Azure AD B2B and what that actually means. What it stands for is Azure Active Directory business to business. And the intent here is when you want to collaborate with external business partners, it's not so much a business to consumer, it's really intended for a business to business scenario, although it doesn't have to be exclusively that way. And really what it means in the Office 365 scenario is that those external users that are invited in through Azure AD B2B can come into your Office 365. And the really cool part of this is that it's completely free for external users in Office 365. There's some confusion out there around licensing. The Microsoft AD team talks about this 1-to-5 licensing ratio. What that means is that, let's say you have an Azure AD premium license for 100 people in your organization, and you want to provide those premium features to external users. You can actually do that in a 1-to-5 ratio. So in that example where you've got 100 on-premise licenses, or not on-premise, staff licenses, you can actually extend that and invite in 500 external users, and they can use all those same premium features. So things like conditional access and multi-factor authentication, you don't actually pay for those additional features. Where the confusion comes in is if you don't actually want those additional features for your external users, you just want them to come into Office 365, you don't actually need to purchase anything from an Azure AD point of view. You can use the free Azure AD that comes with your Office 365 and invite in literally as many as you want external users and pay no licenses either on the Azure AD side or on the Office 365 side. So that's really key to understand is this is a great way. Microsoft has been very good about allowing that external collaboration to happen without requiring any additional subscriptions on that. Now, if you've used Azure AD B2B before, you may be familiar that there's some pain involved in onboarding those external users. And the good news is Microsoft's done a lot to address that in the last 6 months or so to make that a much more friction-free experience for those users coming in. In the past, if I didn't have an Office 365 account, I had to either create an Azure AD account or create a Microsoft account for myself to be able to come in through Azure AD B2B. And people often got lost and confused, and in that process, they dropped off, and it became a real pain point in terms of onboarding those external users. What Microsoft's done now is really eliminated most, if not all, of that pain involved in that. So in the first scenario, if you are an Office 365 user as an external user being invited into the extranet, you just use your existing Azure AD credentials. In fact, if you're already signed into your own Office 365, when a partner invites you into theirs, you don't even see another login. It just seamlessly single sign on right into that partner portal. So it's very easy from that point of view. And if I have a Microsoft account, the same flow and process works from that point of view. Now, where it gets more interesting is if I don't have an Azure AD account, I'm not using Office 365, and you've invited me into your portal as an external user, what happens now, instead of forcing me to create an account, I simply log in with my email address. Azure AD recognizes that, hey, this user doesn't exist anywhere in anybody's Azure AD, and it emails a one-time passcode token to me. It's valid for 10 minutes. I just take that number that's emailed to me, I enter it in lieu of a password, and away I go from there. So I don't have to create an account. I don't have to worry about forgotten password retrieval, validation that I still have access to that email address, because literally each time I sign in a new browser session, it's going to email me a new passcode, and away I go from there. So much, much easier, much lower friction for those users coming in. The other interesting thing is we now have federation with Google. So if your external party, say, uses Google Docs and that's their primary way of working as an organization, they can actually use their Google account to come into your Office 365. So it's actually that same seamless login experience as if I was an Office 365 user. I would hit the Office 365 site. It would prompt me for my credentials. I enter in an account that's federated with Google, and it bumps me over to Google, log in there if I'm not already logged in, and away I go. So again, a very frictionless environment from that point of view. In fact, they've just recently announced in the last couple of days availability of a new public preview for direct federation that even goes further. So if you've got partners that are, say, federated with Okta or 1Password or other ways of logging in, you can actually do direct federation into those federation providers as well. Still pretty early days for that. We haven't dug into the full details of that, so we're not going to go into that scenario from a demo point of view, but I just wanted to make you aware of that. So that's the background on Azure AD B2B and what that is. Now, why would you want Extranet User Manager? What's our value proposition? How do we build on top of all this great stuff that Microsoft is already providing? Well, if we think about the native experience of Office 365 and Azure AD B2B, yes, the onboarding experience works very well, but the actual provisioning process, inviting people in, is not particularly user-friendly. You actually need to go to the Azure portal, which if you're not an IT pro, you tend to find that a little overwhelming. It's very much a technical portal. It's not something that you're likely going to want to delegate down to your end users. And it is an all or nothing delegation. So if you say, hey, this person is allowed to invite users in, they can invite them in carte blanche across the system. So the ability to lock that down to specific groups that you're inviting into and working with that, bit of a challenge from a native experience point of view. We already mentioned the out-of-the-box features from the Office 365, the external sharing. While they're really cool and they work really well, again, not really scalable in terms of larger audiences from that point of view. Then we get into some other things like self-registration, which is a common scenario, one that we're going to dive into here today. There's no support for that, so you need to build something yourself in order to do that, which is doable, but it's work, it's custom development, or you can take a product like ours, drop that in, and you get the self-registration for free as part of that. Integration to other line of business systems, perhaps when somebody self-registers or get invited in, maybe it's not just Office 365 that they need access to. Maybe you've got your own custom applications or other external SaaS applications that you want to federate to as well. How does that get set up? So we can use things like Microsoft Flow to build those points of integration. Even integration into on-premises Active Directory. You might say, well, why would I want to do that? Well, if you want to bring those external users not just into your Office 365, but maybe you've got on-premises applications you want them to access, you can actually create a shadow AD account, use Azure Application Proxy, bring them into to those applications without a whole lot of additional work. You get that single sign-on experience through there. The key things that we provide is that self-registration, the profile management, the delegation model, the fact that under the hood we're still using Azure AD, so we're not doing anything unique. We're actually using the graph APIs that Microsoft provides to automate into Azure AD and send out those invitations, manage that whole process. So at the end of the day, when the external user logs into your extranet, they're actually still seeing the Microsoft login form. Azure AD still manages that process. And I'll show you some branding and some customizations that you can do to still give your flavor and feel to that. And then the whole group membership is a big part of what we manage through there as well. So if we want to think about, when should I use the out-of-the-box external sharing features? When should I use Extranet User Manager with Azure AD B2B? It really comes down typically to the scale of people that you want to be inviting in. If it's just a few people, use the external sharing. If it's a large set of people, that's when you want to use Extranet User Manager and Azure AD B2B. The main goal of both of these solutions is to eliminate the use of shadow IT. You want to make it easy for people to share externally, whether it's from an unstructured or a structured point of view, so that they're not jumping out to other third-party services and setting up shadow IT to circumvent what you're doing. You want to make it simple and easy for them. They will adopt and use it from that point of view. So there's three scenarios that we're going to go through here today from an external sharing structured scenario point of view. They are invitation only, private registration, and public registration. We're going to take a couple passes through here. I'm going to give you a quick overview, then we'll take you through some infographics to kind of explain that process. Then we're actually going to do a live demo and walk you through what that looks like. So the first scenario, the invitation only, let's say I'm the business owner and I want to have external partners coming into my site that I manage. I know who those people are. I just want to directly invite them. I can do one of invitations, which is kind of like the out-of-the-box external sharing features, but maybe I've got an Excel with 100 or 1,000 people that I need to invite in. I can actually bulk import that Excel and have all those people invited in as part of that. So that's the first scenario. The second scenario we call private registration. And the idea here is that there is a self-registration, but there's no self-discovery. People need to get a secure link to start the private registration process there. So the business owner knows someone who knows the rest of the people that need to come in. They don't directly know who those are. So you can send them that link and say, here, share this around, forward it to as many different people as you feel appropriate should come into the site. You may still want to have approvals on that. So when those people get that link, they go through a registration process. You can still vet them and say, yes, should I actually bring those people in or not? You may want to have some auto approval rules that say, hey, if they come from this organization with this email domain, I know they should just come straight in. Don't take it to approval. You can get fairly sophisticated with Microsoft Flow around those scenarios. And then the third scenario is, hey, I don't know who should come to this portal. I know the broad context, and maybe I'm going to do some marketing or push to drive people to a public landing page that anybody can discover and can register. So, typically it gets linked from a public-facing website. You, again, may or may not want approvals. Depends on the business scenario, what that group is for, what that site is ultimately for. And again, we can do things like the auto approval based on things like email domain as part of that as well. So let's dive a little deeper into the invitation-only scenario. So the scenario here, there's two ways to invite people in. We're going to talk about our new SharePoint Framework web part that you can embed right into your SharePoint site. You can even embed it into Microsoft Teams as a tab as well, and you can use that to add users in. We're going to walk you through that scenario. You can also use our Extranet User Manager full admin console that allows people to search and add users to their groups fairly easily from that point of view as well. So that can be, as I mentioned, a single email that's going to a single person that then drives them into your Office 365 site that invitation is for. Or it could be a bulk import Excel that can go out to many people and into the portal from there. So that's a pretty straightforward scenario. The private registration is a little bit trickier. So it starts in the same place. So I'm going to start in that either SharePoint Framework web part or in the admin console. And I'm going to get a secure link for that group that I want to invite people into. And when I say secure, what it is a big long GUID. It's about 32 characters long, letters and numbers. So it's hard to guess, but I'll show you where you get it fairly easily. You can copy that link, send it to people. So that can go through email. You could tweet it, you could set it through chat. It doesn't really matter how you get it to those users. The idea is that, let's say you send it to two people, knowing that, that's not the whole group, but they're the connectors that, they know two friends and so on and so on. It can go to a larger group of people that can then discover and register for that site. Let's say, for example, you want to create a partner portal and your main contact at that partner. So you send them that private registration link, and then they can share it around their organization to say, hey, anybody within my organization that wants to go to the Extranet User Manager partner site, here's the link you need to register. So they click on that link, and they go through a number of steps. The first thing they do is they come to a page explaining, hey, this is the group that you're about to join. I've got this link. Tell me what it's for. Explain a bit before I commit and say, yes, I'm going to go through that registration and onboarding process. If I like what I see, I say join group. I need to log in. So I can either log in with my email address, or if I use Office 365, I can just click through using my already signed in Office 365 credentials and come to a registration form. Let's take you down the email process where I enter my email address. And if I don't have an account on this Extranet site already, it's going to take me right into a self-registration process. In the other scenario where maybe I'm registering for a second site or a third site and I already have an account there, it would skip that registration and just take me right into the onboarding for that group. So once I've gone through those steps, the next thing that happens is you may want to have an approval around that. Depending on how you set the group up, you can say, hey, this just goes straight in. There's no approvals required. We have a fairly simple workflow approval that can happen within our Extranet User Manager product, or we have a full flow connector. So you can have a trigger into a flow workflow. You can get that as complex as you want in terms of the rules you want to define for that registration, and ultimately bringing them into Office 365 from there. So that's our second scenario. The third scenario that we talked about is public registration. So it's very much the same, except that you're not sending a private link out to people. It's actually self-discoverable. And I'll show you a landing site that's part of our product that lets people discover those public sites and join those groups. But the process is the same. They go through those same 4 steps. Again, you may or may not have an approval process as part of that, and then you're into the Office 365 site from there. So those are really the 3 scenarios that we're going to focus on here today. So let's actually jump over into demo. So I'm going to share these links out. These are actually public URLs. I mean, you'll need an Extranet User Manager account set up in order to get into our Office 365, but you could actually follow on and do this process yourself if you go to the second URL there. And that's actually where we're going to start is both in the SharePoint Online site and in the Extranet User Manager site. Let me get a couple browser windows open here. So this is the public-facing site that you can discover public groups in. We're not going to start with this scenario, but I just want to explain that this is where people would go to discover those groups that are available from that point of view. And there's a number of groups that we've got preset up here, both that require and don't require approvals. There we go. There's a public group no approval and a public group with approval. Those are the only ones that are visible as an anonymous user who hasn't signed in here. But I have another browser tab open here that's actually connected to our Office 365 site. And we can see we've actually got 4 groups with 4 different sites set up. We've got those 2 public ones that we just saw, but we've also got these 2 private groups with and without approval available to us as well. Now, we're going to go through the invitation process first, so I can actually choose any of these. I'm actually going to choose the public group no approval to start this process. So what I've done is I've gone to the SharePoint Online site. So this is actually the Extranet site that I want to invite somebody into. And I am a group owner in this site. And what that means is in this SharePoint Framework web part that's showing me the users that are already members of this site, I have the ability to edit existing users, to add new users, to manage those users through here. So let's go through the invitation process and say, hey, let's do actually a demo of adding a new user. And I'm going to use a test email domain that we have that lets me create lots of accounts. So I'll go ahead and do that. And it says, hey, I don't recognize that email address. So we're going to add a net new user in through here. And this form that I've got coming up to add the user is fully customizable. So if there's other fields that you want to capture about your external users as part of this, this can be tweaked. It's simply an HTML form that can be modified as part of that process. I'll go ahead and submit that. So what it's doing under the hood now, it's creating that user in our Extranet User Manager product, but it's also calling down to Azure AD B2B and sending out the invitation as part of that. Now we don't have Microsoft send out the invitation. We actually do that through our product itself, so it's very easy to customize exactly what you want to see in that invitation. I'm going to see there's the new user that's been added in there. If I want to edit the user, remove them, I can do all those things as part of that. Let me flip over to another browser session here. And we can see here is the email that just came through to me, Peter Demo 1, saying, hey, you've been added to the account, and here's a site that you can access to have a look at that. So I'm going to have to run a couple of incognito windows here just to keep the different personas that I've got running separate. So now I'm signing in as that new external user. And I'm actually going to go to SharePoint Online directly to go through that process. So I don't have to accept an invitation or do anything special from that point of view. I just come here, and you can see, even though I'm on the login.microsoftonline.com form, we've actually applied some branding to this. So people have that sense that, hey, I'm coming to the Extranet User Manager Extranet, not to some random Microsoft site. Now this particular user is not set up in Azure AD. Why did it just ask me for a password? Oh, that's odd. It should have gone through the one-time passcode side of things. I think I may have set this user up as an actual Azure AD. You know what? Let me use one of the other accounts that we have there, just to give you a sense of what that looks like. So if I use that ptest1, there we go. Doesn't matter how many dry runs, there always seems to be demo gods that send you sideways. So what's happened is Microsoft has sent a code to that email address saying, hey, here's your account verification code. So I copied that code, entered it over here, and that's how I sign in. So I don't have to create an account. I don't have to do anything special from that point of view. And boom, I'm now into SharePoint Online. And we can see here is that public group no approval that external user was invited into. So I can go ahead and click on that, go over to that site, and I see the same site that I was seeing before. Now this web part is behaving a little bit differently because I'm no longer a group owner. I'm just a member of this site. You know, I in fact don't even have contributed access to any of the libraries and such in here. I only have read-only access. But what you do in the SharePoint Online site is completely up to you. You know, you can define whatever permissions you want depending on what your needs are for that particular extranet portal. So I have the ability here, say, to email individual users, or even to get a registration link if I want to invite somebody else into this group, but I can't edit users, add users, invite users from that point of view. So that's sort of the first scenario where we've gone through and said, okay, let's invite a specific user in through here. So let's come to the next scenario. I'm actually going to close down this incognito window. And now we want to go through the private registration scenario. So let's actually come back up to our list of sites here. Excuse me. And this time I want to use the private group no approval site. So this one doesn't show up in the list of public groups. You can't self-discover it. You need a link to be able to join it. So let's go over here and click on the private group no approvals. Again, we've got our SharePoint Framework web part here. I have the ability to add a user, which we just went through there. But what I actually want to do is get a registration link. So if I look at that link, let me open up another incognito window here. What's important here is this GUID, this big long string of letters and numbers. So it's a unique ID for this particular group, and if you don't know that ID, then you can't ask to join that group. So yeah, you could, you know, try and brute force it, but there's a whole lot of combinations for that potential number. So good luck actually trying to find that. And basically, if that's been emailed to me, communicated to me somehow, I can then use that link to request access into that particular site. So let's actually go through that process. So we started a new incognito window here. So imagine again, I'm a brand new user again, coming through this process, and we've come to the landing page here to say, hey, I just got this link about this private group that I think I should belong to, and we can have some additional details about what that group is, explaining that process. And I'll show you in a minute how we customize the content that's in here. It's full HTML. You can get as sophisticated as you want if you want to have images and infographics and different copy in there as part of the onboarding process. You've got that ability to do that. But first, let's just go through that process of joining that group. So again, same steps that we went through before. I'm going to join by email. I'm going to use another new one, hopefully that works properly from a Azure AD point of view. Go ahead and continue there. Again, it's a net new user. And again, these fields are a little different than the invite user. We should probably make them consistent, but we kind of want to demonstrate the fact that you can have different forms and different fields that you want to capture in different scenarios. So here we're just capturing the name, country, and organization, but you can add additional fields, again, as HTML to that process. So let's go ahead and register that account. So again, this is talking down to Azure AD business to business. It's now taking me through the login process. There we go, that's good. It actually said, hey, let's send a code across. So let's do that. If I come back to my box here, there's my Peter Test 6 that just got invited in, and there's my verification code. Let's just paste that in, sign in. I have to accept some permissions because this is a new account that's coming into Azure AD. I accept that. And there we are. We now are a member of that private group, no approvals. Now there's still some technical challenges we're working through here. What happens is there's a delay from being added to Azure AD and the permission setup before you actually have access to those resources. The best way around that is to actually close the browser window down and log back in again. We're trying to figure out how to make that a little more seamless experience for the end user. We're still working out some of those details. But let's actually go through that process now. So I'm going to close this browser window. And actually, if I come back here and refresh the group site that I was on, we can see there's our Peter Test 6 user that just privately registered on here. Now this site is set up for no approvals. If I had an approval process in there, that new user would show up as a pending member in here, and I would need to approve that user before they would come in. I skipped that step to make the demo a little quicker, but that's the basic idea there. So let's actually go through that process again. So if I open up my incognito window, I come to my main landing site, sign in as that Test 6 account that we just created. So it's a new login. I get a new passcode that comes through. Those come through very quickly, which is nice. And I sign in. And we can see here now that the only site I have access to is that private group no approval site that we had. The way we set up this SharePoint site, it's all security trimmed. So when I join a group, actually what's driving this site here is permissions around which sites you then have access to, and it knows that, hey, I only have access to this one private group no approval site, so it directs me down into there. The nice thing with this approach is that this URL becomes sort of the home page for your extranet. Doesn't matter what sites people have access to, how many sites they have access to, always drive them here. It'll explain the sites that they have access to and take them in from there. And we have the option to actually configure this to auto redirect. If I only have access to one site, just take me over to that site. We've actually turned that off here just because we want to demonstrate and show the experience as you go through that process. So I go ahead and click on that private group. And again, here I'm into a new SharePoint Online site. There's me. Again, I'm not a group owner, so I don't have the ability to edit and manipulate things through there. But let's take a minute now and actually dive down that side of things. So if I come back, I'll just close this window out here, to the owner view of this, one of the other options that we can do in here is actually edit this group. So I can do a lot of things through the SharePoint Framework web part, but there are certain features that you need to actually jump out into our full admin console in order to do that. So this is basically where I set up the entire group to say, okay, what's the display name of the group that we saw through that registration process, but there's also an internal group name. You can prefix that, add your own naming convention to that. That's what actually shows up in Azure AD from a security group point of view. This group ID, that's the GUID that I was talking about, the secure piece of information that you need to know in order to register for this group. And down here, we make it easy for you. You just copy this registration URL. You can see that same GUID is part of that URL. You give people that URL, they have the ability to join this group. Groups can be turned off if you're not using them anymore. It actually removes them from Azure AD, keeps them in Extranet User Manager, so you've got it from an audit and history point of view. And this particular group, remember we said there was no approvals on that, so we've actually turned off the approvals through here. I can turn that on, define who the approvers are for this particular group, so I've got a lot of control over how that process works. Now we did say that this group was available for registration, but it's not publicly available. So if I turn that switch on and save this, it'll actually show up in that landing page where people can self-discover this group. I don't want that because this is a private group, so we're going to leave that turned off. Here we can see the SharePoint Online site that this group is associated with. That kind of wires it all together so that the group's web part works on that site, and that the landing knows how to direct people across to those. I mentioned the ability to explain, what the site was for when you're inviting people in or when they're coming back later to revisit those sites. So this summary is what shows in the initial page. So if we're back on, sorry, let me just jump around a bit here. If we're down here, the summary is what we actually see on here. So I have the ability to actually update that content. It's got a full rich HTML editor as part of that. And then the description is the detail that I get when I drill down to join a site, to explain to me what this site is all about. So when I give somebody a private registration link, it's actually this description that they see on the page before they join that group. So a fair bit of control around what those groups look like. And just to give you a quick tour around the broader product, I have the ability to search through all those groups and say, okay, what groups do I have set up? How are they wired together and working from that point of view? I can add in new groups. I can actually bulk import groups if I want to. I can add and import users as well. So if I have a bulk set of users, I mentioned that scenario that I want to invite in. There's actually an Excel template that you can download. Upload the list of users that you want to invite, load that, it'll do a sanity check on it, make sure everything looks good, and then it'll actually fire out the welcome emails inviting those users into that group, and then they have access into the sites from there. Now this whole interface here is all security trimmed as well. We're seeing sort of the God level rights as a configuration editor, so I can do things like set up the system as a whole. I can configure the emails themselves. I can add and edit groups and users, but you can trim this back. You can say, you know what, I only want this person to be a group editor, in which case they can't do the configuration options, or maybe I just want them to be a group owner, in which case they can only manage the users, they can't manage the group itself. And we see a lot of that within the group setup itself. So if I come back into that first group that we were using, further down on the page, we kind of skipped over this, is where we track the owners, the members, and the membership requests. So if I want somebody to be a business owner from a delegation point of view, I add them as an owner through here. That's what lights up the full features on the SharePoint Framework web part, so they can invite users, edit users, remove users, do all those sorts of things. As a member, I just belong to that group, and whatever permissions have been assigned to that, I can work with from there. The membership requests are where new requests that haven't been approved yet showed up. So I showed you that in the SharePoint Framework part. You can do the same thing here, where you can have users and then go ahead and approve or reject those users from there. So anything you can do on the one side, you can do on the other. This is a bit of a richer interface that provides you more functionality around the product. So I hope I haven't lost you. I know I've been jumping around a lot through different browser windows. We've got one more scenario that we want to go through here, and that is the public group scenario. So let's start another new incognito window here. We'll come back to our landing site and say, yeah, I want to explore your public groups. And as we mentioned, we've got the two groups here, with and without approval. Again, we'll do the no approval process to keep it a little leaner. I go ahead and click on that. This is actually the same page that I get to on the private registration link. It's just that I can discover this without having somebody provided that link for me. So the real difference is this page here, where we can list those groups that people can join, that anybody can self-discover. And the nice thing is Extranet User Manager is fully built on top of a REST API. So as a custom developer, if you want to embed this, say, into your public website and have a rich interface there, you can actually create your own application that calls it to our REST API to provide this same sort of functionality and build it into your site itself. In fact, that's our future plan. We want to have more of a test drive experience on our Extranet User Manager site itself. We want to expose some of this right on the Extranet User Manager site, so you can go through that experience yourself. So I'm not going to go through the join of the public group, because it's really the same process that we just went through the private registration link. It's just that it works without being provided that link. All right, let's flip back to our presentation here. So that's the main demo scenario. There's a couple other things that we're going to go back into, but those were the three scenarios that we want to cover off from that point of view. Now, important question is, well, what does this all cost? You've got this cool product, I'd like to use it. How do you license it, and how confusing is that licensing? Well, the good news is that we've kept the licensing very simple. We basically have 3 editions of the product, and really the only differentiation between them is the number of external users that you're going to be inviting in through there. So we didn't want to go to a model where you pay for every external user that you invite in. We wanted to just have buckets of users and kind of eliminate that question around that. So if you've got 250 or less external users, that's the light edition, which is $250 per month, and an $800 onboarding fee. Standard edition takes you up to 5,000 users, and then the enterprise is basically unlimited. So if you've got more than 5,000 external users, and we've got lots of clients into the tens of thousands of external users, the enterprise edition is where you want to go from that point of view. So we're very public about our pricing. So if you go to our pricing page on our website, it has all the details. It shows you all the features and such from that point of view, and you can go through from that. Now we've been very focused on the Office 365 and structured extranet point of view. I do want to touch on a couple of the other features within Extranet User Manager that maybe we didn't get a chance to dive too deep into. Now we did look at the groups web part. Now, the important thing here is that it's not just for SharePoint, it also supports Microsoft Teams. So let's take a minute and have a look at that. So if I come back to my groups page here, so I want to be in Office 365, and let's actually jump over into Teams in a new tab. So we should actually add Teams to our list of, hey, what are you currently using? Because this is really gaining massive adoption. There's a lot of groundswell and a lot of interest from Microsoft on Teams, and it's really taken off. It's surpassed Slack, which is its main competitor in terms of numbers of users, and it's just continuing to grow gangbusters from that point of view. And the idea is, I think the Teams engineering group's goal is to replace Outlook with the Teams client. So for organizations that are all in on Teams, you actually spend more of your day in the Teams client than you do in the Outlook client. And I would say that's true at Envision IT Extranet User Manager. We're about 18 months into our journey into Teams, and it has completely replaced internal email. Everything happens through Teams from that point of view. Now, this is not our live production teams. This is actually our teams associated with the demo tenant that we're using for this. And you can see here, when we created the SharePoint sites for each of these scenarios that we're talking about, the private and public, no approval or with approval, that actually creates Office 365 groups under the hood and teams associated with that. And I'm going to talk more about how we provision those and how that process works later in the presentation. But we can see we've got our 4 scenarios through there. So if we look at that public group no approval, for example, that we were working with, what we can do is we've actually added a groups web part. In fact, if I go to the plus here, we see here is our groups web part that you add into your Teams channel from there. And it already understands what site this is associated with and wires itself all together. So you don't need to actually configure anything as part of that. You just add it in and it magically understands that, hey, I'm associated with this Office 365 group. And here's my members list that I have there. So the same interface that we saw on the SharePoint side. So if we look at this one here, this is the web part here. And again, I just added it as a web part right onto the page. Didn't need to configure anything. And boom, it's lit up and running, and away you go from there. And it understands, I'm currently signed in as a group owner for this particular group, so I can add users, I can edit existing users, I can do different things from there. Maybe I just want to send an email communication out to everybody from there. I can just select them all. Oops, I haven't actually tried that in the Teams interface. Apparently that doesn't work there. Let's do it over here. If we do a select all and email users, it launches my email client with those users ready to go, and I can fire my email out from there. So a little testing still to do on the Teams integration side of things, but Teams is huge, and that's a big investment area for us as well. So all of the the ability to add, edit users happens through the web part, but then you can jump back into the full EUM interface that I was showing you as well if you need to go further from that point of view. So we took a walkthrough of the Extranet User Manager admin console itself. We didn't go too deep into the user and the configuration side. Let's take a minute now just to have a quick look at that. So if I come back here and go to my home, I have the ability to do things like search users. I can bring up the list of users. Let's actually look for the ones that I've been creating through the demo here. Peter Test 6 was the last one I did. I can go ahead and edit that user. So I can see all their profile details. In fact, we've got a lot more profile fields exposed here that we don't surface in the web parts and other sides. And I can see the groups that this user belongs to. So there's that private no approval group that they got invited into. They also belong to this all B2B users, and I'll talk more about that in a minute as well. And then we have the ability to configure the system. Probably the biggest thing here that you're going to tweak is the email configuration. So things like that that welcome email that comes through, hey, when I invite somebody from an Azure B2B point of view, just like we have the ability to customize the copy that shows on those web pages, have the ability to customize all of the content that gets sent out in those emails as well. I've got tags that can be replaced from a mail merge point of view, and again, this is rich HTML. I can get quite sophisticated from that point of view. Fully branded, so all of the end user pages are fully customizable. We've got lots of great case studies up on our website that show you examples of what that looks like. Delegation is a big part of the offer as well, to say, you know what, I want the business to be able to own who those external users are and grant them ownership rights of the groups that belong to them. And they can do what they need to do from that point of view. IT doesn't become a gatekeeper in the middle there. Self-registration we've talked about, again, not just brandable, but fully customizable. We've got a lot of different examples of very different styles of registration pages, depending on what the business scenario is there. Now, as I mentioned, we've been very focused on Office 365 in this talk, but we do support SharePoint 2010 all the way up to 2019 from an on-premises point of view as well. And most, if not all, of what I've shown you here today applies to on-premises SharePoint as well. Things like Microsoft Teams and Flow only live in the cloud, so those particular features obviously don't come as part of SharePoint on-premises, but everything around the SharePoint Framework web part, as long as you're SharePoint 2016 or later, that supports SharePoint Framework web parts, you can use those components as part of your installation as well. The application is fully adaptive, so for your end users, for your administrators, doesn't matter if they're working on a desktop device, a tablet, a smartphone, we're built on top of Bootstrap, and that's going to work across all of those environments. You can run it on your own data center, or actually our preferred approach is to put it up in Azure. It actually gets hosted as an app service in Azure, which is a very scalable, very cost-effective way of running your application in Azure. Microsoft takes care of all of the underlying, patching, uptime, everything else associated with the virtual machines for that. You just deploy your app, and Microsoft pretty much takes care of everything else from that point of view. We have a full ARM template and deployment process around that as well. Now, I mentioned a few times around Microsoft Flow integration. So we have the ability to have things that happen in Extranet User Manager trigger workflows, like somebody new registering or a new account getting created. And we also have actions for most of the things that can be done through the REST API exposed through our custom connector for Flow as well. So if you want to add a new user, edit a user, change what groups they belong to, add or create groups themselves, that can all be part of the Flow custom actions as well. So let me show you quickly what that looks like here. If we come back here, let me fire up Flow for a second. And if I look at my flows, we actually have a flow here called add new users to all B2B users EOM group. The challenge that we found a little while ago, I think about a year and a half ago, there was an all users group in Azure AD, but they actually changed that so all users excluded external users, and they didn't provide a group that encompassed all external users as well. Which I get from a security point of view. You don't want to expose, something to all users thinking it's going to all your staff, and then suddenly all of your external users can see that as well. But there is a need for that group that includes the external B2B users as well. So what we have is a quick flow workflow here that says, hey, when a new item is created for a new user being added in, then post a new role in here. So add that user to the all B2B users through there. So this flow runs every time a new user gets added. In fact, if I go back to my flows history here, you can see it last ran 18 minutes ago, which is when we added that PTest6 account in there. So that account got created, and it actually called Extranet User Manager and said, hey, put this user into the all B2B users. Where that becomes important is when we come to our main landing site in Office 365. Remember I said this was the one place you want to drive everybody to? Everybody needs to have access to this site. So what we've done is we've secured this site to all B2B users, and that flow makes sure that everybody's part of that group and they can see this site. They won't necessarily see all the sites that are available there, only the ones they have access to, but they need to see the broader communication site that this is part of, and that's the way we achieve that. So that flow integration has a lot of possible scenarios through there. I talked about auto approvals when people are registering. Flow is a great way to do that, to say, hey, what email domain, for example, does this user belong to? And if it's on our list of auto approved domains, go ahead and approve them automatically. So that approval process becomes an action that you call from your flow. Or, if it's outside of that list, then somebody needs to manually review it. So send an approval request to that user that comes through the flow approvals, and on successful completion of that, puts the user into the group from there. So you can build out quite sophisticated flows as part of that. That's a whole topic onto it itself from that point of view. Excuse me. So the last piece I want to talk about is site provisioning, and I gave a whole talk last September on site provisioning. I think I'm actually going to make this our next webinar topic for probably the second week of September, once people get through the summer holiday season. And where this is important is what I've shown you has a lot of different moving pieces, and you want to, as much as possible, automate that process and make it simple and consistent so it's always done in a standardized way. So I've got a whole white paper and an open source project that's up on GitHub around that. And quick overview is what happens is we have a SharePoint list that tracks requests for new sites. And basically we've got a web part that you use to enter those requests. So I'll show you in a minute what that looks like. And again, flow becomes part of the solution. So the flow gets triggered when somebody requests a new site or an Office 365 group or a Microsoft team. You may want to have an approval process as part of that. And then we run Azure Automation to run some PowerShell to actually create the SharePoint site, the Microsoft team, the group, wire everything together and make that all happen. So there's a quick infographic of what it looks like. People come to that SharePoint form that's hosted in the SharePoint Framework web part. Flow fires off, Azure Automation runs the PowerShell, magic happens, and it pulls it all together. So let me give you a quick teaser demo of what that looks like. So if I come back to my Office 365 site, and I come over to the site request page, this has a lot of extra bits on here because we use it from a demo point of view. The important piece is this site request form up in the top right corner here. And the way it's structured is you can have different requests for different divisions. So if you want, different departments within your organization to have different rules as to what they can do, that's what this is about. I can come in here, say I just want to create a temporary demo and choose from a template around that. Now we haven't fully baked this out just yet. We'll have that ready for our next webinar. But the idea is, let's say I choose the group site here. In addition to capturing the standard things like what's the title and the alias of the team that you want to create here, and yes, I want to create a Microsoft team, that all works there, but let's have the additional fields to capture things like the summary and the description. Is this available for registration? Is it publicly available? Is there approvals required? All those decisions that we saw back here in the group page. So if we look at one of those groups, these points here around approvals, available for registration, we can actually expose all of those as part of the form here. We don't even need to write new code for this. The way we built this SharePoint Framework web part here is it actually looks up into a content type and says, what are the fields that are on content type, and dynamically builds the form for us. So it's very easy for you to customize, again, what this form looks like, again, without not even needing to do any HTML authoring or any coding or anything else from that point of view. So that's really our next topic from there, is to dive into that side of things. So there is links. You'll get the deck as part of attending today's webinar. So the link to the source code for that whole solution is there. There's a quite extensive white paper that takes you step by step how that whole process works up on our Extranet User Manager website. So I encourage you to have a look at that. Just wrapping up from here, a couple of upcoming events. So we don't have the next webinar up there. We should have it by the time you get the follow-up from this event. That'll, like I said, likely be the second week of September. But we do also have Christian Buckley, who's our Chief Marketing Officer, and Mark Cashman from the Redmond Product Group are going to be speaking on options for building a modern extranet at SharePoint Fest Seattle. So if you're out on the West Coast, you're going to the conference, by all means check that session out, Wednesday, 1:30. And then we're going to be down in Orlando in November for Microsoft Ignite. So come meet up with us there as well. So with that, we're a few minutes ahead of schedule, which is always not a bad thing. Give you a couple minutes back in your schedule. I want to thank everybody, and just put it back to Logan and the team if there's any questions that are still open that we want to cover off during this, or we'll follow up with those afterwards. Sure, and it depends too whether we're talking about from an on-premise SharePoint scenario versus an Office 365 scenario. So we track analytics through our Extranet User Manager of everything that people do. So when they log into our product, when the account gets created, when it gets edited, all that activity is there. The only challenge is that we don't see the logins happening to SharePoint Online. So you would need to use analytics like tyGraph or other approaches to look at those to say, okay, let's identify users that haven't been active for some period of time and be able to shut those accounts down from there. You could build some Microsoft Flow around that to say, hey, let's look at users that haven't signed into our Azure AD in a certain period of time and deactivate them in Extranet User Manager. It's an interesting concept that we've been asked by clients in the past. We haven't built a specific solution around that, but it's all definitely doable. Awesome. Well, thanks everybody for joining us today. Hope that you found that useful, and look forward to having future discussions around how we can help you build out your structured extranet in Office 365 and Azure B2B. Thanks very much. Bye now.